Welcome to the afternoon session. My name is Greg Toppo. I'm National Education Writer at USA Today, and I'm really excited to present to you this panel and this conversation. You know, one of the things that is always frustrating to me when I come to events like this is you get a bunch of smart people in a room who all know a lot, and one of the sort of things they keep sort of saying again and again and again is, if only, right? If only people did this, if only we knew more, if only teachers or schools or government or somebody did X, everything would be fine, right? And I think, to me, what this panel gives us the chance to do is kind of flip that a little bit and forget the if only, and let's talk about the way things actually are. We always talk about the role of schools in civic education, obviously. But I think what this panel gives us the opportunity to do is to sort of kind of rotate the camera, if you will, sort of 180 degrees, and look at what young people are actually doing in their own time with their friends when no one is watching. You're all nodding, so I think I've got that right. Because I think there's a lot of power in that, and I think it's something that's unexplored, and I think it's something that, frankly, if you don't know the folks on this panel, they spend a lot of their time thinking about this and talking about it and researching it. So I want to dig into that a little bit. I'm not going to, their names are on the board here, so I'm not going to waste another minute introducing them, other than to say that Louise is to my left, and Joe obviously is in the middle, and Nichole is at the end. There are their Twitter names if you like to tweet out the incredible things they say. I want to start, Stephanie Sanford gave us a great model earlier today. She said, let's start with something we all agree with. An issue we all agree on. And I'm going to go out on a limb and I'm going to say we all agree on this. We all agree that we adults, mostly baby boomers among us, we misunderstand how young people consume media, what their relationship is to it, and how it plays into their relationships to one another. I'm gonna use sort of a silly visual reference here, but the conversation that I'm constantly having with people goes something like this. It's usually with somebody of my generation or a little older, and their complaint is this. Those millennials, they just don't get it. They're constantly on their devices. What is the deal with the millennials? They totally isolated from one another when they're using their devices, right? This is a device, right? And our usually, mostly our fathers wielded this very effectively when we were growing up. So I guess I want to maybe start at the end with Nichole and ask you a little bit about what does research actually say about the way young people use media, not just when they're on their own, but when they're with their friends. Let's sort of talk about sort of the top line.
Hello everyone.
That's Nichole.
So the research literature says, if you just take reading, we all perceive that kids aren't reading more, but they actually are reading more. They're just reading differently in shorter bursts, not whole novels necessarily, but on their phone and on their devices, multiple different types of formats. They're also in much more social interaction about what they're reading. We also are too. I don't know how many of you spend more time reading the article or in the discussion section. So in that sense, there's a whole debate about whether we can multitask, but there's a perception that you think that they are actually doing that. So I think it's the how we're consuming media or how they're consuming and interacting with each other is different, but the amount isn't necessarily that much different. Also, we're more social. The perception that youth are interacting with people that they don't know. They're really interacting with with their friends. So I think in some sense, I think that newspaper is a very good example of the patterns. They're different in terms of the formats we're taking them in, but the habits aren't really that different.
And Joe, just to kind of follow up on what Nichole said, can you talk a little bit about what your research has shown in terms of young people and how this relates to their civic engagement, like, their media habits, what the civic output is, if you will.
Well, I think very much as Nichole was saying, we are definitely seeing or have seen a major shift in the sort of technologies that people use to engage with civic and political life, and we're seeing the practice in many respects of politics changing. Some of those things are simply they're reading the newspaper online rather than reading a physical newspaper. But there are also important changes to the dynamics that I think are worth highlighting. I think to a much greater degree, and this mirrors their social lives, we live in a participatory culture.
So, for folks who don't know
yeah.
that, let's define that.
So it's a space in which the assumption that long dominated, if you just think of TV, was one of broadcasting, right? People will tell you stuff, they'll push it out, and there was no focus on the way in which the audience would be active with it, right? Or it was extremely small. And now so if you think of a movie, no one would launch a big movie today without thinking about how are we going to get the public participating in the launch and experience of the movie. And that takes many forms. And maybe McDonald's did it early by just giving you plastic cups when they did a Disney movie. But that has been amplified to an enormous degree. And so to a much greater degree, people are participating. That participation is obviously incredibly important when we're thinking about civic and political life. And so one of the things it means is that our news, for example, which used to be very much a broadcast model, is now very much, there's an intermediary, which is the individual, is mediating what the rest of their friends and social networks see and learn. So we find to a large degree, young people, and in fact all of us, end up following the news that those in our social network tell us to follow. So that has tons of upsides and tons of challenges associated with it, which I think do circle back to the sort of educational priorities. But at a base level, the way people are mobilized, the way they get information, the way they discuss, the way money is raised, all those things are now structured differently in the digital age.
And I want to ask, Louise, there was a reference earlier to Schoolhouse Rock, speaking of TV and the things we grew up with, right? I don't know, would you consider Schoolhouse Rock pre-participatory culture?
Yeah.
Okay. So, but there was a reference to that earlier, and I guess, one of the things I wonder is, do you folks, first of all, embedded in this question is going to be, please give us the primer on iCivics for those who might not know about it. And do you guys see yourself as a latter-day Schoolhouse Rock?
Yeah, I think that's what we aspire to. So iCivics, for those who don't know, is we have a full curriculum for civics in middle and high school, but we use games to do it. So these are simulating. Free, absolutely free curriculum, and the kids experienced what it's like to be a public official, what it's like to be a county supervisor, what it's like to be the President of the United States by actually playing the game. And so that experience of participating in and defining the outcome is embedded in what we do. And there are many of these experiences you could not experience any other way. And I do want to say that this ties into a bigger conversation about instruction, because that process of changing the conversation about so many people, we've talked about news literacy today, and we say, oh yes, we're updating our curriculum, but we also have to change the entire method by which the instruction is provided, right? So that conversation has to be changed. The question about Schoolhouse Rock is that it was engaging. People remember it. They keep it with them. That's what we do at iCivics. We have a little, I'm going to try really badly, but in the White House, when you run ads, you are more likely to do well in a particular state, whatever color that is. And when you run the ad, it goes blah, 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 blah. So the kids, if I had kids who had played iCivics, they would have, that's the first thing they would have told me. Blah, 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 blah. And so that
Into
they
the
remember,
nonsense.
they remember that, they feel they associated with it, and so that's what we're hoping. What we would like, obviously what Schoolhouse Rock had that we don't have, is this broadcast or this way to reach every kid in the nation. That's our goal, 10 million kids a year, and it would be really helpful if the media industry were to get on board with that.
I mean, being free helps, certainly.
It
right?
certainly helps, but you have to also have a policy. You also have to a change in the education model.
One of the other interesting things, just not to give you guys too much of an infomercial, is that it's very lo-fi. That it it doesn't require a PlayStation 4. I mean, you can play it on your junky
Chromebook,
old school
yeah,
computer.
Yeah.
So and while you're talking, one of the things that occurred to me is that when you talk about things like the blah 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 and the political ads, is this idea that I think we as people in the education field, we sort of downplay the importance of nonsense and delight and play and these squishy concepts that seem like they'd be the enemy of something serious like civic education. And I guess I just wonder, I'm going to sort of open this up to the whole panel. Like, let's talk about play. Let's talk about, these sort of seemingly sort of two things on opposite sides of the spectrum, right?
Right.
The seriousness, you must learn about how the government works, or else our democracy will fall. Okay, that's the proposition, right? And on the other side is, no, you enjoy the silliness of this ad while you're learning this.
Right.
Any thoughts on that?
So we were founded by Jim G. Those of you who know his research will tell you that the concepts of play, including failure, including the fact that you don't know where the outcome is, in fact that you have agency as a student to define the outcome, those things are critical to engagement and they're critical to getting to a learning outcome. So the beauty is to manage, to balance these things, right? Mm-hmm. To balance the instructional goals, knowing exactly what you're going to do with these playful elements. And that's an art, it's not a science, but it's very important.
Yeah, I think some of the work we've been doing in Chicago, I think gets at this intersection of play and understanding civics, but in reality is how do you create context where you have to use what you're learning. It's not let me just learn it, it's let me apply it, but let me not just apply it to the election every 4 years for now. Let me apply it to my life, my reality, my block. And so one of the first projects we did was something called Digital City Planners that ended up at the United Nations, where we said, here's X amount of money, what are you going to do in your community? But you have to understand and work within all the zoning rules and things like that. And so that created an excellent opportunity for students to want to know and to want to actually understand, what's an alderman? What does an alderman actually do? Why is this thing zoned? Oh, you can go about and changing these things. And it actually led to some students actually getting plots of land and actually doing something with it. So I think we think of play as out of school, and hard learning is in the school day, and I think there's ways that you can bring those two together, and particularly for underrepresented youth, I think it's essential that we make civics, bring it into the local, because there's too often, at least in my experience, the perception that civics is much more around going to the opera or voting for president, not about what you can do today to change the reality in these and not in their communities, our communities, where it takes understanding the local politics.
And I want to, while we're thinking about Chicago, I want to ask you if you could talk a little bit about some of the work you did with UMedia and MacArthur. First of all, explain a little bit about what UMedia is, and also I know it's a very short session.
Okay, I'll do it real quick.
But I've always loved the Mimiito concept of the three phases, if you will, of
So UMedia is really just imagine library space, and we were asked a question. MacArthur, Julia Stash, and Kahne Yao at the time, who was program officer, came to the library, and I was not in the library, was professor, and asked the question of, well, how could you make the libraries relevant for high school youth? And we were asked to bring our work around youth and digital media into the library space. And I instantly was like, this is not going to work. No high schooler is going to want to come to the library after school.
This is the public library.
The public
downtown.
library. But it was fortunate it's in the place, Harold Washington Library, downtown Chicago. The library gave over the most prominent spot, 5,000 square foot, right off of State Street. And we worked together with game designers, Katie Sell and Mimi Ito, whose work on hanging out, messing around, and geeking out really talks around about how you need multiple different types of spaces.
Say that again. Say that
Hanging
again.
out, messing, homago, hanging out, messing around, and geeking out.
Yeah.
Okay, I should know this by now. And that any interest develops. You know, you first have to have an opportunity to just be someplace and see it, and say, oh, I want to actually do it, and to play with it on a low scale without having to make a direct commitment to doing it. Before you know, you want to geek out, and at the point when you geek out, you say, this is my identity, I want to go with it. And what we realize, and I think this is relevant for civics, that there's very few places where youth, particularly high school youth, have an opportunity to just hang out and mess around. That's not a mall space that actually has the access to the resources that can let them tinker with developing the types of literacies and using the types of literacies that are valuable. And where you've seen this really work well is we call it Louder Than a Bomb poetry. It says Brave New Voices poetry, which is around the country. And students are getting a great opportunity to understand and to address and think about civic issues through their voice and through poetry. So quickly, one of the things one of the features of the U-Media space is a recording studio, and had recording artists there. But it was one of the few spaces where youth could come in and record their own albums. So if you know music now, you've heard of Chance the Rapper. You might have heard of a young man named Vic Mensa, who's phenomenal, and also a phenomenal artist named No Name. All three young artists, two were nominated Grammy. No Name, I think, should be, very will be. All came from U-Media. 3 different high schools. No one talks about it, because we don't really know about it. But this is a space supported by MacArthur that high schoolers felt was a place where they could be. They didn't have to be scheduled, and they had access to the resources. But then they also had access to mentors who were critical to force them to not just create, the next trap song, but to really think about their lyrics and to think about what they were creating in a way that really was addressing what's going on in the community. So if you listen to all their lyrics, you'll look at it and say, wow, there's something different about what Chance says, also with Vic. But the other thing that brings us all together, and finally we'll be quiet about this, is you see the work that Chance is doing. It didn't just impact his music, it also impacted the way he gives back. Right? He's saying it's my responsibility to help my city. He's donating money, but he's also leading programs. So I think there's possible to create these spaces that bridge out of school and in school, that first create a home for where kids who want to do this work can be together, but then shows them exemplars that makes the civics real on an everyday basis.
I would say you have a few exemplars coming out of U-Media, I would say. So I want to ask Joe a little bit about his research and talk a little bit about it in the context of politics. I was thinking about your work when I read the Steve Bannon, the Joshua Green book about Steve Bannon and Donald Trump. I don't know how many people have read that, but fascinating little kind of nugget in the middle of it is that Bannon came to sort of a lot of his political realizations while investing in a gold farming operation with World of Warcraft. So if you don't know what gold farming is, basically he hired a bunch of Chinese teenagers to play World of Warcraft 24/7, win a bunch of items in the game, and then sell them in real life. The players found out about it, they got very upset, they rebelled, they told him, they kicked him out. But one of the things he realized was, spending so much time in this world, was that there was this very interesting, sort of angry, young, mostly white, political roiling going on beneath the surface. And he started to tap into that and said, there's something here. And all I could think of is, wait a minute, I think there's research behind this. Can you talk a little? Can you talk a little bit about, what your research has shown in terms of maybe not gold farming and World of Warcraft, but the connection between online communities and civic engagement.
So, haven't read that,
Yeah.
so I don't know the
Trust me,
details there.
I described it perfectly.
I believe it. I think there's a couple dynamics there that are things that we see that are important to pay attention to. So one is the power of these communities and these activities for the young people who are involved in them. And I would say, we were talking a little bit about play, and play can be key, but what's really key is that young people are connecting to the activity. And there are a bunch of ways to get people to connect to an activity. One of them is to be part of a community. And if you're part of a community that has a sense of membership, a sense of purpose, everything else that happens within that community has more relevance and more buy-in for you. And so I think a piece of what Steve Bannon clearly found out, but what many people have found out is that those powerful communities can exist online. They aren't only the kinds of things that you have in your neighborhood or with your group of friends or the people you went to school with. They can be online, they can be virtual, but they can still be very powerful ways of mobilizing. And part of why the online is so relevant for politics and for civic life is that those communities become mechanisms for mobilization, they become mechanisms for sharing information and the like. And for everything, tied to disaster relief. They don't always have to move in a kind of dark, horrible way, but they can move in a positive way because people feel a sense of community, and community is very powerful. So I think thinking about what are the roles of that in an educational context, and I mean educational broadly, in a learning context, is super important.
I mean, when I was researching my book on games, one of the great interviews I did was with a young man who was playing World of Warcraft while recovering from anorexia. And he became such an avid player that he became a guild leader. And the way he describes it is that he grew to be part of this really interesting community worldwide. And so he would run the guild, but he would also be responsible on the side for sending baby shower gifts from the group to somebody who's having a baby. So it really talk about expanding clearly outside of the game. He just was working at the White House actually, as it turns out. But your point taken. Yeah. So we have a couple minutes before we want to open it up to questions. Do I dare ask the question? How do we take the power of something like this and translate it into school, or is that not a really interesting question? I mean, maybe we should just stay outside of the institutions for a while. I don't know. Maybe Louise.
Oh, I'm a school advocate, so.
So you say it is a good question.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. How about you, Joe?
Absolutely.
I think I guess I would say it's a both. I mean, I think that there's no doubt that you want to leverage the power of everything young people care about, right? And that's one of the things they care about.
Okay.
But I would also say school provides, it isn't organically positive. And school provides also an opportunity to prepare young people to make the most of the power of digital media. And learning does more generally, which I think is a lot of what Nichole's group does with the media.
I would agree. I think it's both.
You would agree? Okay. So we've got a yes and two boths.
Yeah, I mean, just to be clear, it is one of the only public institutions in which touches almost every kid, right? So if your goal is scale, if your goal is to touch across racial, gender, every line, then you're going to have to go through schools.
But I would say, I think we do have to think about our distribution channels. And so, if you create an educational game, oftentimes we think that you have to convince the teacher. But if I create a game, I just push it on Facebook. So how do we begin? I mean, most kids probably aren't going to go online and search in the Apple Store and say, give me a civics game.
Right.
But they will probably play it.
Right.
If it's available to them. So why aren't we, when you get your phone, why isn't Apple and everyone putting some learning things that are just on, why isn't iCivics on every iPhone? Why don't we begin to think about why isn't iCivics
we are on every iPad, but that's all right.
Okay.
Oh, you are?
We are on tablets, and phones are too small, but
so it's already
yeah, we take that very seriously.
Yeah.
So it's already been done.
Wait a minute, you're on every iPad?
No,
What?
not every iPad. I mean, we have a free app which is distributed through the App Store. It is now used by 5 million.
I think that's the critical point here is that I still have to search for. I mean, to be able to say when I get my iPad, it's an educational, if it's an educational iPad, it should come with these opportunities, these games. The same way I give my nephew, I give him an iPad. He's 4, but I've already put everything on there that I want him to play with. And that's one of the things we learn from games. You feel like you have choice. But in reality, it's already been structured for you.
I mean, if you can put U2's album on every iPhone ever made, right? You can put
I see.
Do I Have a Right? I will say, before we go to questions, I just want to say, give one more plug for iCivics. So if you haven't played these games, I would say start with Do I Have a Right? It is probably the only time in my gaming career that I laughed out loud as I was failing miserably. It's basically sort of Diner Dash meets the Bill of Rights.
Yeah.
Really just remarkable
I've not heard
design, remarkable lo-fi graphics, hilarious, kind of sort of Django Reinhardt French jazz soundtrack. Really just talk about just like pure pleasure. And you're learning, what the 14th Amendment is in the bargain. Let's go to some questions from the audience. I have 3 very simple rules. So tell us who you are, tell us where you're from, if that's germane. And also, please make it a question, okay? I will actually, maybe I'll give an award to the shortest question. Should we do that? Talk about game mechanics. If you have the shortest question, we'll figure out something we can give you at the end of the session. Are there mics or are we just standing up? Oh, there are mics. 2 mics. So just raise your hand and one of the hosts will come find you. I think people are just stunned by the brilliance. Oh, there we are. Bunch of questions over there. Remember, who you are, where you're from, make it a question.
Hello, my name is Mikey Stroh, and I'm from Collier County, Florida.
Okay.
First of all, I love iCivics. I tell all of my teachers about it as soon as I have the opportunity. My question is, and it's short,
Good.
what is next for iCivics?
Thank you. You will see that Justice Sotomayor joined our board a couple of years ago.
Okay.
She set out a very ambitious goal that we would reach the community of Spanish-speaking English language learners. So coming up is a Spanish version of Do I Have a Right in
dynamite.
December. We are extremely excited about this. It's going to make a huge difference to English language learners. So that's what's next.
I have to say, by the way, I have like a, if you give a shout out to iCivics or UMedia or any of these guys, you get an extension of your question.
Yeah.
Quickly.
Also Joe's and Nichole's
Joe's-
research.
So wait a minute. So it's going to be in Spanish?
It's going to be in Spanish and with other supports for English language learners.
But while we're thinking of it, can you just you never really got into the Justice O'Connor angle on iCivics. Could you just give us the
Short.
minute-long lecture on that?
Yeah, so Justice
really
O'Connor was our founder. She had this idea when she stepped off the bench in 2006 that really our country, that there was a fundamental problem that people didn't understand, particularly about the election of judges. That was the real issue that she was concerned about, and that represented a misunderstanding of our Constitution and sort of the values that we use. And so she set out and she found Jim G. And together they created this set of games that really was just her dream, right?
Yeah.
And she inspired us. And if you've never met Justice O'Connor, many of you I think have, you will understand this is a woman who doesn't fool around.
Right.
So no is
What's
not an
amazing to me.
answer, and you better get it done.
Right.
So we got it done for her, and we now have 5 million kids using the platform, and Justice Sotomayor came to carry on the legacy from the court.
That's great. And one of her clerks actually tells the great story of her, once it was developed, brought it into her chambers, and her son basically pulled out a laptop, started playing it, and she was standing behind him going, "This is so fun."
Well, at that point, I don't think
love that.
Justice O'Connor had ever opened a computer.
Right, exactly.
So this is Julie O'Sullivan, Professor
Okay.
Julie O'Sullivan from Georgetown.
So, okay, other questions? Let's go over here. Maybe, do you have a question on your side?
There's one here.
No? Okay. Whoever, I'm going to just leave it up to the mic people.
Hi, I'm Sterling Speer, and I serve on the board of our community foundation here in Washington, D.C. Used to be president of the Kellogg Foundation. I just read Jane McGonigal's Reality is Broken. I'm not a gamer. Well, I went to the arcades in the early days when it cost a quarter, but
You're a gamer.
but to Joe's point, but she convinced me that the people, people play games because they get tremendous rewards and as well as a sense of community in tackling epic challenges.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering what you see in the field of games for good or games for change. I'd love a game from my city state here in the District of Columbia that everybody played and where we all cared that all of our kids were
Yeah.
going to be successful and not only civically engaged, but learn to read. And rather than, I've been in the philanthropy world for a long time, but I'm thinking there needs to be a better way where everyone is involved in a game of epic proportions that's very civic, but that everybody's involved. And I just wonder if you see anything like that emerging in the gaming world.
It's not like a DC statehood game or anything, is
Yeah,
it? That'd
yeah,
be a
that
great
too.
game.
Pokemon Go.
It'd be amazing.
Yeah,
Sorry.
So there's a couple things. We have a game called Counties Work in which residents get to encounter problems that are local. We're trying to make that customized to a particular city right now, in which it would be a way for government to use gaming for its own purposes. And I think we really do need to it's not a one-way street. We need to re-understand how government deals and connects with people, and by actually using those tools that people use now. There's just exactly the way that you started this. So I think government needs to reinvent itself, not only people need to reinvent their relationship together.
Great. Any other questions
This
down
one
here?
right up here.
We're going to go to another table after this, but go ahead. Yes?
There's
Is there a
one
question?
up here, up front.
This young lady right here. There we go. You guys are doing a great job keeping your questions short.
Hi, my name is Lena Trelawney. I'm the associate editor at Education Dive, and I'm from Jackson, Mississippi. I think that it makes a lot of sense that games can help kids get engaged and learn material like civics education much better in class. One thing that I'm curious about, though, is that a lot of civics teachers end up having issues actually doing the process of getting kids involved in the engagement process, which is having them voice their opinions and actually hear out other students in the classroom and learn how to deliberate and converse with those opinions, which we saw was a big issue recently. So I still don't see the buy-in into gamification and applications in that part of civic engagement, though. So could you explain how it could maybe get kids more accustomed to talking with other people and hearing their opinions, which is a huge part of being a citizen in a democracy?
So maybe can I try to interpret your question? So it's one thing to be able to play a game and learn about a system, but it's another thing to be able to have a conversation about it. And what role does the game play in that, if any?
So I think in our work, we never think about you're gonna play a game for 30 minutes and it's gonna necessarily be transformative. Sometimes they are, but how do you integrate that game with other sets of activities? So how do you learn to collaborate, work together, or be a critic? So I think those are things that develop over time, and I don't think it happens in a one-off project. But if you are in a school space or an after-school space that has that built into the process that works. So for us, we would imagine playing a game, but then now how do we take those lessons learned like we did in the digital city planner and now put you in a role-playing simulation, right? Where you now have to use your knowledge, but you're constrained by by the rules of the roles that you actually have to play. And we've had high schoolers across 40, 50 different schools working together when they're playing within a role and trying to work towards a common good, and I guess developing those social emotional skills and those communication skills are necessary. So I think when you just say, if you just look at what happens in the game, you might not be seeing all the other support structures that are built around the use of that game in the educational context. And I think when done well, you also are building out those skills also.
It's interesting because, like Louise, you must sit in on classrooms all the time. I mean, it's got to be a wide variety of abilities of teachers to process what's going on, to keep a conversation on track. I mean, if that's not there, how effective is the game?
Well, the game will be effective, but as Nichole says, the real effectiveness comes through teachers, right? And I think this is a thread throughout the day today, the investment in teachers, in giving them the tools and the abilities to have these really hard conversations. Diana is much better at speaking about this than I would be, but having those conversations across diversity is absolutely critical. And we do that, so we call it a game sandwich. Yes, there is a game, but the sandwich is the teacher who brings everything together.
So the game's in the middle.
The game's in the middle.
Okay. Okay. You know, Joe, just speaking of like diversity of opinion, I mean, you've got some really interesting work on this. Can you talk a little bit about, you know, how when what's happening in young people's lives in terms of their social networking and whatnot is not built around politics, if I'm interpreting what you've done correctly, that there's a bigger diversity of viewpoints that they're exposed to.
So I think, yeah, I do. I think what you're saying can be important. So if one of the issues that we've been talking about on some of the panels, or the panelists have raised, is the issue of the echo chamber and the degree to which when people pursue content, they often pursue content that aligns very closely with their own beliefs. And one of the things that we find is that as young people engage in what we might think of as interest-driven communities, which they frequently do online, not necessarily a game, but it could be a gaming community, but it doesn't have to be, that the political diversity in those interest-driven communities is often much greater, as well as just the interest diversity in other fields. So in general, youth socialize with other young people. But when they're in online communities, they're frequently interacting with a much broader range of people, geographically more diverse and politically more diverse. So one of the things that we find is that young people's exposure to diverse political perspectives is greater the more they're engaged in non-political interest-driven communities, because those kinds of communities lead to the exposure. The other thing I'd say though, and you know, I gotta go back to sort of, you know, being in an ed school, is that you
always have to go
can
back.
teach, I know it can be painful for people, but there is something about teaching too. So when teachers do lessons on how do you find diverse perspectives online, and they assign it, and it's not an uncommon thing for teachers to do, kids go out and get exposed to diverse perspectives during their discretionary time to a much greater degree than they do when kids don't get that experience in school. Because, and it's not hard to believe, most kids, to Nichole's point, don't sit around going, I wonder what other people think about the environment. Let me look up a range of viewpoints.
Right.
That's not something most kids do.
So you've got to make it explicit.
But when you make it explicit and you give people some direction and you help point them to some valuable sites, they do become more likely to do that kind of activity during their discretionary time. Gotcha. And I think, you know, it's that kind of interaction that I think Louise is talking about when she says the game plays one role, but ultimately we need the educator to leverage the power of the game and to connect it to other powerful opportunities.
And we also need the community, the parents, the community organizations, because I think that's where it's really critical to see that it's not just, you know, what's taking place in school, that it is connected in. So I think the whole ecosystem has to play its role in articulating and talking about the utility and value of those core civic concepts and how what they mean at the national level, what they mean at the city level, but also at the neighborhood level and even in the home.
I actually think this is a place where there is a great deal of support from parents. There's a great deal of support from teachers, that's for sure. But I also think that parents actually want their kids to grow up to be informed citizens. So I think we have an ally, we just have to leverage it.
Good point. Okay, it's time for one more question, maybe two if they're quick. Anybody?
Oh, Stephanie.
I'm
Well, I don't know
not
if
in
you should
control.
give
You guys are in control. Stephanie.
Stephanie Sanford, College Board. So I've read recently that there's a big shift among young people towards video rather than text. One, are you guys finding that, and how do you deal with that? Because what strikes me across all of this in this gaming is that it's highly engaging, and it's highly interactive, and it's highly reciprocal. How's that, if at all, bumping up against this move away from text and towards video among young people?
Well, I think we all communicate with as the vehicle communication gets cheaper, so now it's as cheap to send video, then it's richer than text, and people are going to communicate with those vehicles. So I just think that's natural. But if we look at the VR, and I mean, I don't know how much conversations have been around the utility of VR and being able to actually situate yourself in historical times with, in conversations to understand those contexts. I would imagine that games are going to begin to move much more in that direction. We already saw that, New York Times sent out the paper VR machine. So I think we're going to see the move to that. But at the end of the day, it's still going to be the same concepts, some of the same instructional practices that are just going to be played out differently. But I do think the ability to actually be on the battlefield, if you will, and see what Gettysburg was like, I think and then if you can layer that with conversations with characters, but also conversations with classmates about what they experienced if they looked at it from a different perspective, I think it's going to enrich conversations both in schools, but also in homes and also in communities.
Unfortunately, we are out of time. Please join me in thanking all these wonderful people.